I just want to make a quick apology up here at the top for the audio quality of this episode. It is subpar. There were all kinds of problems that you're going to find out about as we go, but I just don't have the time to redo this. And so I'm cobbling it together, and I appreciate your patience and perseverance. In the last episode, I discussed the 4 basic strategies. Maybe there are more, but the 4 that I discussed are essentially physical force, trickery, skill, and you could say luck, or a kind of spiritual approach. Which are, they really are different, but when it comes to the attitude towards survival, they have a similarity. Because even if you're someone who doesn't believe in God, if you're not a very spiritual person and you're living by luck, or if you're a spiritual person and you believe that God will provide, you're essentially placing your life in the hands of some other force. Whereas if you're going about it on the basis of some skill, and you can say that like skill really incorporates both trickery and violence or force. So in both of those domains, in all those domains, you're trying to put your life in your own hands. You're trying to determine your own fate. And of course, like I said before, these are not mutually exclusive. We may have periods in our lives or different domains within which we use different strategies, but in general, they fall into these categories. And I want to talk about today the concept of "may the best man win," which was a phrase which at one time was, I think, far more common than it is today. But we can see that within any field of competition, so in all of those skill-based fields, there's admiration for the one who excels, and a sense that they are the ones who deserve the benefits. On the other hand, there's a great deal of envy that comes along with all of that, and so quite often there may be a kind of public-facing adulation and celebration of such people, but quite often that's followed by behind-the-scenes efforts to undermine these standouts, these sports of nature, they call it. A sport is someone who stands out from all the rest. And you could make the argument that even within the spiritual domain, you have a similar thing when it comes to, spiritual leaders, gurus, that kind of a thing, where there is admiration and envy and all of the attendant complexities of that. But I think that it's interesting that in some respects our culture has lost that sense of "may the best man win." And I'm just going to ignore the gender aspect of this for the moment and speculate that this may have something to do with the end of a line. Because in essence what that is implying is that you want to see the best for the largest number. In other words, if you have the most excellent on your team, then your team stands to win. And so whatever your group is benefited by having the best competitors. And if you're no longer celebrating the best, in other words, if it kind of comes down to an inverse celebration, where you're celebrating the weakest, and you could say that, well, that is, in some sense, the inversion that happened as a result of the victim narrative. And so I think of this as being something which sprang from Christianity. And if you look at this from a Girardian perspective, René Girard points to the innovation that Christ brought to the world in being the willing scapegoat, and how that undermines the fundamental mechanism whereby... So at this point, something happened that has never happened before. My recorder just stopped recording for a few moments, which is just amazing. The number of technical problems happening right now is overwhelming. While I'm listening to this and editing, I'm trying to figure out why a video I just made won't play. And then I notice, okay, yeah, so it just drops out here for a minute. Now, okay, it was raining, and I can see that later in the file there's going to be another spot where stuff is missing. You know, I've been having this fantasy that I would just record stuff and upload it without doing any of this editing process, and I guess this is the reason why that's such an unrealistic idea. So at any rate, I think what I said over the next few moments was that when you disable the scapegoat mechanism, then society doesn't have the ability for it to reconvene its common lie. So there's a way in which everyone is ignoring some basic uncomfortable truth, and if a society goes about blaming an innocent scapegoat, then, you know, if the society identifies that scapegoat as an innocent, it's going to have a hard time performing the act of the ritual sacrifice. So in the old days, there would be a belief that, you know, the witch was responsible for all the terrible things happening in society. And what Jesus essentially, the story of Jesus, let's just make it as simple as possible. We don't have to argue about the extent to which this was what actually occurred, but certainly the story has occurred, and the story is something that has made us very sensitive to the position of the sacrificial lamb. And so we're no longer able to go through that process of expiating the malevolent force through this scapegoat mechanism, which is essentially a fraud. And that what we see happening in, I don't even want to say the West, but I think in general there is this Christian understanding of the innocence of the defenseless that has permeated through all sorts of aspects of society, and which gave rise to the victim culture that we see manifest in things like wokeism. I think that that's basically what I said, and it took a lot less time than what I just did now. So here we go, returning to this original file of victim narratives, which are, let's be clear, utterly justifiable. There have been countless victims, different groups, over the course of human history who have been abused, sometimes to the point of extinction, by those who have excelled. And so you could say that humanity does carry guilt with respect to its own species. And the extent to which we have concern over those who are downtrodden is the extent to which that guilt is felt pronounced. Is that an actual sentence? I'm not sure. Felt pronounced? You know what I mean. So I think there's a cycle that happens in history where those who rise to the top become civilized, because of the benefits that they've accrued to themselves. They're able to think about the other, not as a competitor, but as a vanquished victim who has suffered, and they could see, having endured the battle, that they could just as easily have ended up being the vanquished. And so they now have an understanding and sympathy when they're outside the fray and they're enjoying a good meal and having the good life. Some, not all. I think that there are some who are just unrepentantly living the high life. But others... In this section that's missing, I'm really not exactly sure what I said. It's a bit longer than I thought. So I think the basic idea is that you have some who find themselves within the side that has prevailed, that has dominated the world, that has established, let's say, a life of all of the pleasures. And within that, you're going to have some who are, as I said before, unashamed of that and just like essentially conspicuous consumers enjoying the high life. And then you have others who start to recognize that all of this is being enjoyed on the backs of others who have been treated terribly elsewhere and sometimes nearby. And then this next thing that I say has something to do with power. You can see the way that power is asserting itself around the world. Power making its moves around the world. And that horror kind of brings a distaste to the meal, to all the various pleasures of life. And so there's a feeling of a need to correct, to atone for one's sins. And obviously we see these narratives playing themselves out within our civilization. But this is also quite often coincident with a kind of weakening of the protective vigilance of the society. And so things start to fall apart. And that brings back the force of will of those who are determined to keep their status. And you could say, well, that's kind of the right versus the left. Or at least those are the narratives that are co-opted by those who paint things in left-right. There's an idea within Taoism that's basically a real person is entirely plain, unnoticeable. In other words, they're not a standout, they're not a sport. They just fit in and kind of blend in to the environment. And so you could say that from that point of view, the ambition is to be as well adapted to the circumstances as possible so that you're not wasting energy, which is really dramatically different from the attitude in, let's say, the West. I'm not sure if it's really, I don't think it's actually just relegated to the West. So that's probably not an accurate way of saying it. I think it's really just more the aspiration, the aspirational impulse within humanity. That's manifest in all different cultures, all different civilizations. And I think that one of the reasons for the Taoists placing value on this, what might seem to be a kind of mediocrity, is an understanding of the consequences of ambition. So what happens to a society that values the exceptional so much. Yeah, everyone grows up within a certain social circle, but that social circle is vastly augmented when you have technological mediation where images of the excellent, of the supposed excellent, are constantly being presented to you. Let's drill into the supposedly excellent remark that I just made there, inferring essentially that quite often the ones who get the most celebrity, while they may excel in one way, they are later revealed to have serious character flaws. And I think, this is something that has increasingly become true over time. I think it used to be that celebrities, there was less of a desire to tear them apart. But now I think that the society is lifting up people who shouldn't be celebrated quite often, and then whose defects become apparent to everyone. And I think this functions on kind of multiple levels. Because quite often people are left with this feeling of inferiority on the basis of all of these celebrities. It satisfies the sense that, well, really, they're not that great. So the audience, the masses, get a certain amount of relief when they are shown that their celebrities are kind of despicable. But unfortunately, I think it also operates on another level, which is that it demonstrates the corruption and degeneracy of our society to the world, which can be used as a way of justifying the destruction of our society. I think that that's another theme that's happening now, because you have to remember that for much of the world, there's a deeply religious sensibility about right and wrong. And many of the celebrities in Western society behave in a way that is just obviously unholy, let's say. So anyway, getting back to whatever the heck I was saying before. Within the realm of sport, for instance, we all get to see these people who can do remarkable things. In the past, there might have been one person in a village every few generations who was that incredible, and so people who happened to be living there would witness those abilities in a small number, but it wouldn't make its way around the entire world. Such a barrage of images of the levels of achievement that seem so distant. And of course, this will inspire some to strive, but it will also discourage many. And, you could say that we have a motivation problem in our society right now, and I think that this may be part of the story. Most of us don't want to compete at a level that seems to be so far beyond our grasp. And so once you see someone who is clearly beyond your ability and you can't imagine ever getting to that point, it's very discouraging. I remember I used to work with Bill Dixon, who was a trumpeter, flugelhorn player, free jazz, let's say a figure within the free jazz world. And he told me that he went with his contemporaries back in the day to go see Dizzy Gillespie play at the Apollo Theater. So basically, a bunch of his trumpeter friends, they all went to go see Dizzy play. And after that evening, he said all of his friends quit. And he resolved that he was not going to play like Dizzy. He wasn't going to try to compete because it was absolutely impossible. There was no way he would ever be able to achieve that level. And so what he developed was essentially a unique vocabulary on the instrument, which a lot of people can't appreciate. But nevertheless, was, I think, a quite remarkable solution to the problem. And he carved out a career for himself and a reputation and made some rather extraordinary music as a result of that. Not without its flaws, but still an amazing musician in his own right, and really in his own right. I remember seeing, when I was down at the Jazz Preservation Hall Society in New Orleans, they had a big poster that was prominently displayed there that was the Tree of Jazz. And so you had, you know, the foundation, like let's say maybe Satchmo, right? He would be closest to the trunk, and then further out maybe you'd see Dizzy Gillespie, right? And you had that for all the different, you know, musicians and composers kind of on their own branch. Bill Dixon had his own little branch. It was a tiny little branch with just Bill Dixon on it. So he achieved something unique, despite its flaws, and it was an answer to the dilemma of what to do in a field where the excellence has already been achieved beyond your wildest dreams.
In other words, where the best man had already won.
And I think that this does bring us back to the concept of hubris. The ancient Greeks recognized ambition as something having a corrosive effect on the soul, a corrosive effect on the society, potential catastrophic consequences. I think of the myth of Icarus as being an example of that. You know, daring to fly so high that essentially the technology abandons you as you come to believe that you've overcome the limits of being a human being. And so I think that in many respects, nihilism and a kind of bitterness about life is a result of the ambition. You know, it also has to be acknowledged, though, that civilizations tend to rise and fall on the basis of their most ambitious. So the technological edge really does play an incredibly important role in maintaining the integrity of a society. Maybe integrity is the wrong word, you know, just basically keeping it alive, you know, preventing it from being overtaken, the technological edge. But it has a corrosive effect. And I think in some respects, all of this leads back to population, because it's the competition, the fierceness of the competition that leads to the necessity for the technological edge. And when you get to the point where essentially anyone is up for grabs to the most powerful player on the board, right? Then the motivation for continuing the escalation of excellence is never relieved. You're locked in this arms race. And I do think we are reaching the breaking point of that, to the point where the human being itself will break. You know, they say that alcohol and drug addiction is largely fueled by a desire for greatness that has been abandoned. So kind of a wistful or even desperate type of dreaming about, you know, lost glory, or having clinging in some small way to the dream of ascending the heights. And you can see this in much of the marketing, particularly when it comes to the microbrews, The total domination ale comes to mind. And so I think that a lot of suffering happens as a result of all of this, and that there is an alternative, which has to do with a far more modest way of going about life, a humble way of going about life, a kind of peaceful existence, but that perhaps none of that is possible within the context of a highly competitive, densely populated globe. Now, this is not an argument for depopulation. This is just simply an observation of the dynamics that appear to be happening. And so, in some respects, I think we are all forced to accept the inevitability of this arms race and of whatever kind of radical transformation it's going to produce, because none of us are willing to, let's say there is such a small number of us who would be willing to give our lives to make way for a more peaceful future. You have to wonder, some of the smaller groups, like some of the native tribes and the Shakers who decided to stop reproducing, whether this was the kind of thing they had in mind. And I think that it's pretty obvious that if you want to create a more peaceful future, the fewer competitors there are, the more likely that is a possibility. But we are so far along in that story that, to simply want peace is, while worthwhile, perhaps, I think it's somewhat naive. I have always been a believer that the peaceful path is always the better path, but I also recognize that I live within a society where this is becoming increasingly untenable. And I certainly hope that some of the radical changes that we're seeing happen right now may lead towards a more peaceful world. I don't think that's likely, but I think it's more likely than what we saw with the previous administration. So I have some small hope that something miraculous may happen. And again, I find myself wishing success, that the reforms will be done properly and that the world will be brought to an understanding, and that we might proceed in a way which will still have its nightmarish dimension, but won't be as fully catastrophic as what appeared to be. We appeared to be heading towards World War III, and we're still, I think, a hair's breadth away from it. So let's see if we could avoid that, shall we? Doesn't that seem like something everyone could agree upon? But again, it's difficult to talk sense when people are freaking out. And there's a lot of people freaking out. And so I am not willing to say that, let's say, for example, that Elon Musk is the best man, but I do hope he will win. I will hope he will prove himself to be the best man and that he will win, because we need a winner in this situation, and we need a winner whose primary goal is not to destroy others.
Now, one of the countervailing bits of information that I think is important to mention here is that Elon is deeply embedded with a lot of people who are dedicated to the Zionist cause. And while it may, he is obviously made a lot of declarations in support of Israel. But also, he is playing the role, like to a T, like just way too perfectly, of an Edomite. I don't know the extent to which he knows this himself, but from the point of view of the prophetic tradition, he is the very spitting image of the arrogance and hubristic aspirations of Edom. So that's scary. Very scary. Elon appears to be someone who doesn't really care what other people think. And so the extent to which he's willing to completely fulfill that role, I don't know. He has been associated with Epstein. He's got a lot of dirty laundry, and he may well be a controlled figure. It's also interesting to take note, something that occurred to me the other day, which is that the idea of going to Mars, if you were going to take that and place it within a, let's say, biblical framework, or perhaps just an ancient, never mind biblical, right? In the ancient world, going to Mars would essentially mean going to war. And so, this is a perfect example of why Elon fits so deeply into the Edomite narrative, that, the Edomites are considered warlike and technological aspiration on the basis of dominating in war and of reaching Mars, reaching towards the god of war. The symbology is just too much. So the degree to which we can think of someone who necessarily has the interests of our civilization at heart, I think it's very dodgy. But we're kind of in a position where we're left with nothing but hope. And I think that right now we have to hope that things work out well and not assume the worst. There's a lot of validity to psychometric energy. And quite often people end up becoming the demons that you are telling them that they are if you keep on insisting that that's what they are. So part of the force at play is what the public is saying, and the extent to which that kind of corners the people who are in power. So, not a great situation, but it's the one we have to work with.
The thing that's most frightening about the Zionists is that their primary goal is to destroy others. They want to destroy not only the Palestinians, but also Iran, and pretty much anyone else who will get in the way of those objectives. And I find that terrifying, and I think we should seek a better path forward for everyone, including the Israelis. I think the Israelis should, I think the harder you are on the Israelis, the more convinced they're going to be that their prophecies are coming true. And so it's really a very bad idea to want the same kind of fate for the Israelis that they want for their enemies. It's quite bizarre that that's how it was constructed, but that is precisely how the prophetic narrative was constructed. They believe that towards the end times, they will be despised amongst all nations. And so the closer it gets to that, the more they feel that prophecy is being fulfilled. And that will harden their resolve towards their aims. So those of you who are hating Israel with all the depths of your soul, which I think many people feel and is an understandable way to feel, think twice about that. Some things are very counterintuitive. It's not entirely clear that petitioning for the thing that you want is going to lead towards the desire you want. It seems quite often that it's most certainly the case that's not the way it works. So I think a lot of very well-intentioned and good-hearted people have a tendency to petition for things that just end up making things a lot worse. which does kind of bring us to perhaps the the core issue that we're confronted with today, which is the extent to which democracy is a functional system. And if it's not a functional system, and we're all going to go down if we allow things to proceed on the basis of what we have previously considered to be democratic process, then is it not reasonable to hope for competent leaders who will get us out of this mess, even if it means breaking some of the rules of a system which is obviously already broken? I think I already recorded something else along these lines, so I won't say too much more about it, because I don't know if I can find it in the piles of things that I've recorded that I've not yet released. Maybe I'll try and release it soon, but I don't want to repeat myself too many times. Although I am sure that I will continue to repeat myself, because these themes are all interwoven, and it's certainly the case that some of it cannot be fully understood unless it's heard over and over again, and that's certainly the way I've learned, to whatever extent I have learned. And it's not the only podcast that says the same thing over and over again. Of that I am certain. So with that, I will bring to close yet another episode of the Assembly of Silence. I hope that you found this worth your time, and if you did, there are things you can do to help me out. And that is much appreciated to those of you who decide to take that kind of action. Until next time, adios.